The Boeing B-17 Flying Fortress is a four-engined heavy bomber developed in the 1930s for the United States Army Air Corps. Although Boeing lost the contract because the prototype crashed, the Air Corps ordered 13 more B-17s for further evaluation. From its introduction in 1938, the B-17 Flying Fortress evolved through numerous design advances, becoming the third most produced bomber of all time, behind the four-engined consolidated B-24 Liberator and the multi-role, twin-engine Junkers Ju-88. From its pre-war inception, the USAAC promoted the aircraft as a strategic weapon. It was a relatively fast, high-flying, long-range bomber with heavy defensive armament at the expense of bomb load. It developed a reputation for toughness based upon stories and photos of badly damaged B-17s safely returning to base. The B-17 dropped more bombs than any other U.S. aircraft in World War II. Of approximately 1.5 million tons, were dropped from B-17s. In addition to its role as a bomber, the B-17 was also employed as a transport, anti-submarine aircraft, drone controller, and search and rescue aircraft. The prototype B-17, with the Boeing factory designation of Model 299, was designed by a team of engineers led by E. Gifford Emery and Edward Curtis Wells, and was built at Boeing's own expense. The B-17's armament consisted of 5.30 caliber machine guns, with a payload up to 4,800 pounds of bombs on two racks in the bomb bay behind the cockpit. His opinions were shared by the Air Corps procurement officers, and even before the competition had finished, they suggested buying 65 B-17s. Development continued on the Boeing Model 299, and on the 30th of October. While models A through D of the B-17 were designed defensively, the large-tailed B-17E was the first model primarily focused on offensive warfare. The B-17E was an extensive revision of the Model 299 design. The fuselage was extended by 10 feet. A much larger rear fuselage, vertical tailfin, rudder, and horizontal stabilizer were added. A gunner's position was added in the new tail. The nose remained relatively the same as the earlier B through D versions had. A Sperry electrically powered manned dorsal gun turret just behind the cockpit was added. A similarly powered manned ventral ball turret just aft of the bomb bay replaced the relatively hard-to-use Sperry Model 645705D remotely operated ventral turret on the earliest examples of the E variant. Two experimental versions of the B-17 were flown under different designations, the XB-38 Flying Fortress and the YB-40 Flying Fortress. In early 1942, the 7th Bombardment Group began arriving in Java with a mixed force of B-17s and LB-30, B-24s. A squadron of B-17s from this force detached to the Middle East to join the 1st Provisional Bombardment Group, thus becoming the first American B-17 squadron to go to war against the Germans. The B-17s were primarily involved in the daylight precision strategic bombing campaign against German targets ranging from U-boat pens, docks, warehouses, and airfields to industrial targets such as aircraft factories. The USAAF continued using the B-17 as a day bomber, despite misgivings by the RAF that attempts at daylight bombing would be ineffective. The Air Corps, renamed United States Army Air Forces on the 20th of June 1941, used the B-17 and other bombers to bomb from high altitudes with the aid of the then-secret Norden bomb site, known as the Blue Ox, which was an optical electromechanical gyrostabilized analog computer. 1942, 12 B-17s of the 97th, with the lead aircraft piloted by Major Paul Tibbets and carrying Brigadier General Ira Eaker as an observer, were close escorted by 4 squadrons of RAF Spitfire IXs on the first USAAF heavy bomber raid over Europe, against the large railroad marshalling yards at Rouen-Sotteville in France, while a further 6 aircraft flew a diversionary raid along the French coast. Since the airfield bombings were not appreciably reducing German fighter strength, additional B-17 groups were formed, and Eaker ordered major missions deeper into Germany against important industrial targets. Of the 291 attacking fortresses, 60 were shot down over Germany, 5 crashed on approach to Britain, and 12 more were scrapped due to damage, a loss of 77 B-17s. Additionally, 122 bombers were damaged and needed repairs before their next flights. 1941 involved Colin Kelly, who reportedly crashed his B-17 into the Japanese battleship Haruna, which was later acknowledged as a near-bomb miss on the heavy cruiser Ashigara. On the 2nd of March 1943, 6 B-17s of the 64th Squadron flying at 10,000 feet attacked a major Japanese troop convoy off New Guinea, using skip bombing to sink Kyokusei Maru, which carried 1,200 Army troops, and damaged 2 other transports, Taiyo Maru and Najima. On the 3rd of March 1943, 13 B-17s flying at 7,000 feet bombed the convoy, forcing the convoy to disperse and reducing the concentration of their anti-aircraft defenses. The remaining 7 transports and 3 of the 8 destroyers were then sunk by a combination of low-level strafing runs by Royal Australian Air Force Beaufighters, and skip bombing by USAAF North American B-25 Mitchells at 100 feet, while B-17s claimed 5 hits from higher altitudes. On the morning of the 4th of March 1943, a B-17 sank the destroyer Asashio with a 500-pound bomb while she was picking up survivors from Arashio. At their peak, 168 B-17 bombers were in the Pacific Theater in September 1942, but already in mid-1942 General Arnold had decided that the B-17 was unsuitable for the kind of operations required in the Pacific and made plans to replace all of the B-17s in the theater with B-24s as soon as they became available. Special airdrop B-17s supported Australian commandos operating near the Japanese stronghold at Rabaul, which had been the primary B-17 target in 1942 and early 1943. B-17s were still used in the Pacific later in the war, mainly in the combat search and rescue role. Wally Hoffman, a B-17 pilot with the 8th Air Force during World War II, said, "The plane can be cut and slashed almost to pieces by enemy fire and bring its crew home." Martin Caden reported one instance in which a B-17 suffered a mid-air collision with a Focke-Wulf FW-190, losing an engine and suffering serious damage to both the starboard horizontal stabilizer and the vertical stabilizer, and being knocked out of formation by the impact. Given German Balkencrew's national markings on their wings and fuselage sides, and Hakencrew's swastika tail fin flashes, the captured B-17s were used to determine the B-17's vulnerabilities and to train German interceptor pilots in attack tactics. 3 damaged B-17s, 1D and 2E series, were rebuilt during 1942 to flying status by Japanese technicians and mechanics, using parts salvaged from abandoned B-17 wrecks in the Philippines and the Java East Indies. Following the end of World War II, the B-17 was quickly phased out of use as a bomber and the Army Air Forces retired most of its fleet. In 1946, surplus B-17s were chosen as drone aircraft for atmospheric sampling during the Operation Crossroads atomic bomb tests, being able to fly close to or even through the mushroom clouds without endangering a crew. The B-17 Flying Fortress became symbolic of the United States of America's air power. Many pilots who flew both the B-17 and the B-24 preferred the B-17 for its greater stability and ease in formation flying. During the war, the largest offensive bombing force, the 8th Air Force, had an open preference for the B-17. Memphis Belle, one of the first B-17s to complete a tour of duty of 25 missions in the 8th Air Force and the subject of a feature film, now completely restored and on display since the 17th of May 2018 at the National Museum of the U.S. Air Force at Wright-Patterson AFB in Dayton, Ohio. Murder Inc. A B-17 bombardier wearing the name of the B-17, Murder Inc. on his jacket was used for propaganda in German newspapers. Royal Flush, B-17F-42-6087 from the 100th Bomb Group and commanded on one mission by highly decorated USAAF officer Robert Rosenthal. She was the lone surviving 100th BGB-17 of the 10th of October 1943 raid against Munster to return to the unit's base at Raththorpe Abbots. The Swoos, initially nicknamed Old Betsy while in service, the Swoos is the only remaining intact B-17D, built in 1940, the oldest surviving Flying Fortress, and the only surviving B-17 to have seen action in the Philippines campaign. She is in the collection of the National Air and Space Museum and is being restored for final display at the National Museum of the U.S. Air Force at Wright-Patterson AFB in Dayton, Ohio.